Imagine you created a website which cost $2 million to make, but which made $10 billion. That would be a return on investment of 500,000%. Well, this is what Max Nefyodov did with the Ukrainian government before the war when he helped create and pass into law the website ProZorro, which means transparent in Ukrainian. So what does ProZorro do? Well, governments spend money primarily on two things: buying stuff and paying salaries. And when the Ukrainian government wants to buy something, they have to advertise this on the website ProZorro. And then if someone wants to sell the government that thing, they have to place a bid on the website ProZorro. And all of this is publicly searchable by any Ukrainian, or indeed by any non-Ukrainian. It is completely transparent, hence the name. Finally, when the government buys that thing from one of the bidders, they have to state who they bought it from and for how much. And this prevents governments from buying an overpriced asset from one of their friends and the government official getting a kickback. And this is how ProZorro has saved Ukraine an estimated $10 billion in public money in the past few years. Now, I don't know where you're watching this from, but there sure as hell is nothing like this in the United Kingdom where I am right now. I wish there was, and I'm pretty sure there's nothing like this in the United States. So this is a technology that Ukraine actually exports to other countries. I spoke to Max in Kyiv in May this year, and we were delayed filming by an hour because of an air raid, which is ironic because we were talking about missile strikes quite a lot. And Max is a fascinating person to talk to because he doesn't want Ukraine to be seen as a victim in need of help, but as a strong country able to help other countries, just as Ukraine has exported ProZorro to other countries. Plus, several Ukrainian friends have said that Max is a potential future president of Ukraine. So if you want to see what a future Ukraine could look like, I urge you to watch the entire interview. We cover many different topics. So without further ado, please enjoy this conversation with Max Nefyodov.
My name is Max Nefyodov. I'm actually an investment banker. I spent 10 years in corporate finance and in private equity. Then after Maidan, I joined the government. I was the first deputy minister of economy, and then I had a short stint as a head of state customs of Ukraine. And after that, I finally got fired. And for the last 2.5 years, I got back to business, to consulting. And since the war started, I'm also a co-head of the Damaged in UA project, the project where we collect, verify, and evaluate all information about damages and losses and needs caused by the Russian war.
So I should address a couple of things on that introduction. You're technically an ex-investment banker.
I'm technically an ex-investment banker, so I still have, like, right now already a couple of ongoing negotiations with the clients. So I hope it's not only ex.
Oh, okay. Because people don't always love investment bankers, but people love people who help fixing broken countries. So we got to win the audience over at the start of the interview.
You can call me ex-investment banker. I turned to, like, from the dark side to the light one.
And you've started the interview by mentioning that you got fired. We'll come back to that. You told me that story the other night, but people might be asking about that. But yeah. Secondly, can you tell the audience where we are and why this is significant?
Well, we're currently in a small park in downtown Kyiv. It's basically one of the most central locations in Kyiv. It's sort of like a smaller counterpart to New York's Central Park. It is just across the main campus of the #1 Ukrainian university, Taras Shevchenko Kyiv National University, and the famous sculpture of Taras Shevchenko, national Ukrainian poet and artist, also stands here. And this is actually a playground in the park, and it was one of the locations that was hit by a Russian missile, I think about half a year ago, and together with also some buildings close to it. It was renovated, and it's actually one of those signs of this war. So absolutely barbaric and indiscriminative bombing and just terrorist attacks by the Russians, but also, you know, the resilience of Ukrainian nation that was able not only to recover from it, but basically you can see like kids playing there and people playing with their dogs and eating ice cream, and all this again in a day when we also had today 3 air raids and probably close to 50 rockets and drones shot down in the vicinity of Kyiv.
Right, so we were actually delayed setting up filming today by an hour because we had another air raid. And I didn't want to ask my team to come out during an air raid because this morning at 11 a.m. I heard explosions outside while I was drinking coffee. So these are not false alarms, these are real air raids.
Yes, they were like close to 50 actual rockets and Iranian-made drones that were shot over Kyiv or just in the vicinity of the city. Luckily, the anti-air, anti-rocket protection works better these days, and it shuts down maybe like 95% of all rockets, as opposed to maybe 40 or 50% at the beginning of the war. But it's still not 100% proof, and still, even if it shuts it down, there are the debris, and there are these like hundreds of kilograms of warheads that are still falling down somewhere and creating fires and injuring and killing people. So unfortunately, it's not a joke, and it's a very big contrast, to the usual serenity of the place. Again, you can drink, flat white from the handmade, hand-roasted beans, and you can eat ice cream and you can play with your kids. And the next, hour, you can be bombed by some Russian idiot.
Right, and when this was bombed, I know when it was because it was 5 days after I left Kyiv the last time I was here, and I was staying in an Airbnb just there. And one missile landed here, and another missile landed just on the crossroads where I used to cross the road every morning to get coffee. And I think at that time there would have been no air raids, no anti-aircraft. These missiles killed a lot of people when they landed. People had no warning they were coming. It was the first time central Kyiv was hit during the war, I think.
No, I don't think it was the first one, but that was one of the like the most obvious barbaric signs, because there are cases where, at least in theory, you can argue that there was some kind of important something close by. So in many cases it was really strange and bizarre, in some kind of like B movie made in Hollywood. I know that one of the first housing buildings in Kyiv that was damaged by a Russian rocket, I think on the 22nd or the 23rd of February last year. Actually, it was bombed because it stood on the territory of an military grounds, and 20 years ago the land was repurposed from some kind of Soviet-based military facility to basically like housing. And like the military is gone there for 20 years. There are like big housing blocks and kindergartens built there, and the Russians obviously use some kind of outdated maps and that shoot there indiscriminately. I mean, it's really strange, and it's maybe something that people in the West, especially those who never been to Ukraine, they don't understand. They might have this image that if you have a battleground, it should be something, like the D-Day. So, you can't drink coffee in it. You can't go to McDonald's and you're expecting that everyone is living in underground shelters and I don't know what, making munitions.
Right, the people that have chosen to sign up to fight.
Yeah, but actually, there is, as I said, there is a big contrast. So life goes on, because eventually, you need to eat, you need to sleep, you need to work, because you need to eat something. And kids are growing, and yes, they are studying, maybe not in their school, but maybe online. And yes, people are going to the hospitals, and yes, cars are needed to be refueled. So, from one point of view, life seems to be going on. From another point of view, unfortunately, people are dying every day, and buildings, schools, hospitals, bridges, are being destroyed.
I heard that this playground was rebuilt in 3 days, which brings us onto the topic of rebuilding Ukraine in general. You told me something the other day which surprised me, which was that the bottleneck is not the funding available for Ukraine to rebuild. It's that the funding bodies have overly stringent requirements in order to allocate the funding, and that a country that's just been invaded can't meet these stringent requirements. Is that a fair summary?
Well, actually, rebuilding is like a pipeline. So, I mean, you can have choke points in many positions. Some of them are natural, just because, for example, Ukraine will definitely have a lack of engineers or a lack of qualified architects to design all those thousands of repairs or completely rebuild from scratch or just designed, from the ground up objects. And then, of course, there are those limitations that just come from the fact that many donors, many international institutions, many countries, they still operate in some kind of pre-war mentality, both in terms of urgency. So you obviously understand that usual international projects come years into planning, making, signing documents, hiring zillions of legal advisors and so on. But also the requirements to the recipients as well, because it's fairly difficult to meet many of them. It's fairly difficult to fill in all the paperwork by people who sometimes have no electricity or no water, no internet. We're sitting in Kyiv, in the capital, and while it's still dangerous, it's by far much better than those territories that are really devastated close to the front lines and so on. And they will face many difficulties, and currently the government is working and the civil society, which I represent here, is also working, to solve all of this. And I do hope that our international allies are also doing their part of the job to make actually it feasible.
And there are a few different points to pick up on there. One is Ukraine lacking engineers and architects because it didn't have them before the war, or is it because it lost personnel during the war?
Well, first of all, I don't think that obviously Ukraine was some kind of powerhouse in construction before the war. So Ukraine had some possibility to construct buildings and plants and bridges, but I mean, it was not huge. It was enough, to sustain the level of infrastructure that existed. And second, of course, this capacity diminished greatly because of the war. Some people were killed, some people were drafted to the army, some people were forced to flee, as refugees, or were forced to take other jobs, just to feed their families. And the needs, on the opposite, they increased multifold. While before the war, Ukraine maybe built a dozen bridges a year because, you don't need that many bridges. I mean, Ukraine still already had some kind of operational infrastructure. Now you have to rebuild hundreds of them. And some of them are going to be very complex projects. And you need to do this fast because it's not a normal situation. While in a normal situation, when, for example, you're designing a new block of the city, I mean, you can go through a planned construction and you can sell out, lease out the properties and so on. And now you just need very fast to construct places where people will have to live, because otherwise they won't have a roof above their head during winter. So all this combined, of course, puts limitations on capacity, and this is something that I think international community should look up to. Not only about the financial aspect, because money is obviously important. I mean, without resources, unfortunately, not much can be reconstructed. But also to training people, but also to bring in new technologies, including energy-efficient technologies, including inclusive architecture, which is good for women of all ages, for people with special needs, for the elderly, for low mobile people, for veterans and so on. Also in terms of security, because I don't think that for very long time any school in Ukraine is going to be built without a bomb shelter and so on. So this all needs to be taken into the account. And then, of course, it's also the issue of Euro integration, because Ukraine is luckily already a candidate country for the EU accession, and we do hope that this process, as well as NATO accession, is going to accelerate. And this also means that all this new infrastructure, new buildings, new roads, plants, schools, utilities, they need to be designed, in line with the EU requirements, the EU directive, so that they're all interconnected and work together.
And is the solution to bring in people from outside, or is it just to train Ukrainians to build these things?
Well, I think that it should be both. First of all, of course, I'm much more fond of the concept that reconstruction should be owned by Ukrainians, or projects should be owned by Ukrainians. It's very seldom a good idea. I mean, even in your personal, endeavors, if you just, some kind of impose a project or an idea or build a machine, upon someone. It should be, in line with their desires, in line with their needs. They should work on it, and they should eventually, live with it, and not that it was some kind of, a present that was helicoptered from Brussels or Washington, or any other country. And from another point of view, of course, you need to supplement it with international experience, because if there is anything good to be taken out of the war, because obviously war is misery and a lot of suffering, and while of course a lot of bravery, but still these are dark times. But eventually it's a big possibility to rebuild the country, to rebuild the infrastructure, not as it was, not as, Soviet obsolete, this central planned by some, Soviet party or whatever, but to rebuild it using, again, as I said, new technologies, new approaches, modern urbanist mechanisms, and so on. And for this, we obviously need a lot of expertise from the West, from the developed countries. So we should use it as an opportunity to make Ukraine stronger, better, and more modern.
And are you talking about primarily public money, or are you also thinking about how Ukraine could be an attractive market for private investment?
I think it should be obviously started with institutional financing, because right after the war, the risks are still high. And obviously, the first money that is going to come here is going to be some kind of bilateral financing or aid financing from international organizations or from other countries that support Ukraine. Then, of course, it should be supplemented by private money, because eventually Ukraine needs not only grants, some kind of humanitarian aid. Ukraine needs jobs and Ukraine needs investments. It's not a charity. It's not just, some kind of poor people you should help to make them, not hungry. But you should actually integrate them into the world value chains, and we are absolutely sure that Ukraine will make the EU stronger and the NATO stronger, and that Ukraine is able to be an important part of world food security. Ukraine already is an important part of the world's IT infrastructure and development, and so on. And then the third component that is probably equally important is also, the Russian funds, because eventually it's only fair that the countries that actually caused all these damages and all these untold sufferings, and the oligarchs, which are basically, just like they're fronting Putin and his clique, their funds should be confiscated, and their funds should be used for Ukraine's recovery.
And I didn't actually know this until the other day, which suggests that maybe some other people didn't know this, but there is a precedent for countries paying reparations after wars. I know about the First World War, but this happened with Iraq and Kuwait.
Well, I don't think that the idea of reparations per se is very popular in the current international law, but the idea of compensation for damages is, and there were really different types of precedents where countries were paying for damages. The one most obvious example, yes, it's Iraq paying for the damages caused to invasion to Kuwait. They've paid over $51 billion over 29 years, and it was paid using part of the proceeds from the sale of Iraqi oil. But then there are other precedents of types that can be very similar. You can, for example, take a look at the Lockerbie settlement, when basically the Libyan government paid for the destruction and the loss of lives caused by Libyan-sponsored terrorism, and it's basically a very similar case. There were cases when funds belonging to foreign governments, such as Iran, for example, were confiscated to compensate for losses caused by their wars and aggression. So there is really, corpus of legal material you can work from. It's not easy, and I'm no lawyer myself. I do understand that it's difficult, but there are already positive developments in this regard, starting from the Reykjavik Declaration that was signed by just under 50 countries to make an international register of all losses and relevant claims made to Russia, to Belgium already transferring part of the proceeds of using frozen Russian state funds to Ukraine. I mean, these are small precedents, but I think they pave the way towards a more sustainable solution, because eventually recovery is not only about rebuilding physical infrastructure. And that's a very important point. Recovery is about rebuilding trust, because Russia damaged worldwide not only Ukrainian roads, hospitals, and houses. Russia and some of the allies are trying to demolish, the whole global concept of security. That since World War II, people thought that, there can't be no wars of aggression where you just, like in the feudal times, you try to grab foreign territory because you think you can, because you have the knights or the legions or the army, and you just, like, I don't know, in 300 Spartans, you just come and tell, okay, yield or something like this. And this is what actually very surprising to people. I think even many of our viewers might not imagine it. They still have in the back of their hands that there should be some rational idea against Russian aggression. And they start to still looking for it. Or maybe Ukraine still did something wrong. Maybe it is still the victim to blame. Maybe you misbehaved them. Maybe you somehow insulted them or something like this. And unfortunately, it's not. It's a war of aggression. And repairs, should be not only to physical repairs, but actually to trust. And this should mean that the invader shouldn't get any fruits of the invasion, because it sets a very dangerous precedence to other, wannabe Hitlers all around the globe. If they think that they can steal something and then keep 20% of it, so they should pay for it.
So that's a military solution. That's not financial reparations. That is making sure that Russia does not gain any land, and the way to stop them gaining land is by military force.
Well, land is one thing, but if we are talking about recovery, we are talking about paying for the recovery. Right. So again, it's a very strange, surreal situation when Russia destroys, and then it is supposed that taxpayers of other countries, Ukraine included, but also the UK and the USA and so on, should take the toll. It's really strange. Like, maybe from the humanitarian perspective, again, it's good, and I'm extremely grateful to people of other countries that eventually donated part of their taxes to supporting Ukraine. But I think that first of all, we should try to take Russian assets, both the frozen assets of their central bank, the frozen assets of Russian oligarchs all over the world, and also potentially proceeds from Russian oil and gas.
Which leads us onto damaged.ua, which I should explain is a URL. So it's damaged.in.ua if people want to look it up. Can you explain what this is and when did you set it up?
Well, basically on the second day of the war, Ministry of Economy and Ministry of Justice and the President's office approached Kyiv School of Economics and a couple of experts in the field to try and build the register of all damages, and I became the co-head of this project. When it all started, no one knew neither how to do it, because again, it's an unprecedented situation. You can't have a textbook on how to collect, evaluate, and assess damages, from an invasion, but also from the point of view of the size of it. So no one at the first day understood that we are talking about hundreds of thousands and millions of damaged objects. So not just something that you can count by hand. That's why, it's a fairly sophisticated operation which involves already hundreds of people. Some of them work in the analytical part, where we have sectoral analysts that collect information from different government organizations, from mayors of cities, from business associations, from reputable media, from self-reporting via our website, different Telegram bots, and so on. And they also build the methodology on how to check this information, how to evaluate it, how to check for errors, and so on. And also we have a very large operation where we use drones and satellite imagery to take high-resolution pictures of damaged cities. And then we have built software in order to analyze all these buildings, to classify them, to check the type of damages, and to build a database where you can basically click on each building and you can see a picture of it before the war, say on Google Maps, and right now as it was damaged. Again, from one point of view, it's fairly unprecedented, and it shows how modern technologies changes everything we know about the war. But it also shows that, again, that this is some kind of very strange situation. People are used to the wars going somewhere, in the places about which they can read maybe, a column in Financial Times, or, whatever journal, they're reading. But here you can actually watch it online. You have high-speed internet, you have drones flying around, you have satellite imagery, you have 3D maps of buildings, you have soldiers who are able to use their iPhones and Androids to take videos of everything. This is what is happening. It's very strange. No one ever expected it, even in some kind of science fiction dystopia. But regardless of this, if there is anything positive, I do hope we'll have a much more thorough information about what was destroyed, who suffered from it, what are the evaluations, how to make independent verification of it, and I do hope that we'll be able to make Russia pay for it faster than Kuwait did, as I mentioned, within 29 years.
Is this technology that could be used for something else afterwards?
Well,
not just in Ukraine, but in other countries.
I would obviously prefer it to be obsolete and never used anywhere, but actually a portion of it is funded over by UNDP, United Nations Development Program, specifically to be able to use it in catastrophe responses, not only wars, but volcano eruptions, hurricanes, tsunamis, or whatever, all around the globe. Again, to make recovery faster, because cases like Haiti's recovery after the earthquake also can't be considered true success stories, and I think technology can play a role here. Because right now, for example, we can definitely say that Ukraine's direct damages are probably close to $148 billion. We know of around 158,000 housing buildings, both large apartment buildings with dozens or hundreds of apartments, and individual houses damaged or destroyed.
Ukrainians seem to be much more technologically sophisticated than people in the UK. And for instance, the fact that Ukrainians use Telegram, which I think is a superior messaging app, whereas people in the UK use WhatsApp, is one of those indicators. I'm struck that visiting here during the war, people use phone-to-phone payments seem to be much easier in Ukraine than they are in the UK. You have Wi-Fi on the metro. I mean, you've spent time in other countries. Do you feel this is an accurate generalization that Ukraine is more technologically advanced than other countries?
Well, that's an irony of the developing countries, that in many cases you can leapfrog, other technologies, more redundant or legacy technologies. And I can't say whether it's good or bad, but it is one of the answers to the constant question when people just, take the current trend and then calculate that Ukraine will need 30 years to reach Poland, and then maybe 70 years to reach the level of UK, and so on. Well, yes, I mean, if you continue doing what you're doing, but potentially you can implement technologies and you can rely on new ideas and solutions, and usually people are much more open to these solutions. And yes, I mean, Ukraine, from the point of view of, for example, mobile payments or high-speed, mobile internet, is relatively developed. I think that we have one of the cheapest costs of broadband internet worldwide. And the reasons for some of these are pretty prosaic. I mean, we were one of the last countries to issue 4G licenses in Europe, and our operators were able to implement the latest technology. And operators in other countries, they've made huge investments, and obviously they don't want to, to reinvest and to buy something new. The same is with mobile payments. So Ukraine doesn't have a very developed network of physical bank outlets, especially outside of large cities, and it's obviously much easier for people to use their payments or to use just QR codes to pay or send money to everyone. So I mean, in Ukraine, no one would probably be very surprised by Revolut or this similar like fintech companies, because I think in this regard Ukraine fares quite well. And then also you need to remember that Ukraine is an IT powerhouse, especially in comparison to our population. The country constantly ranks the first places in all the major IT charts of IT outsourcers, in the cybersecurity, and in many others. Again, that's not just a coincidence. Ukraine has very decent technological education since the Soviet times. So Ukraine was the major producer of Soviet rockets. Ukraine is the major producer of Soviet planes, and so on. So the country traditionally had a lot of technology universities. And also life in Ukraine is relatively comfortable. So people don't have this constant idea that once they can earn a ticket to Berlin or London or Paris, they want to flee. So there is a big community and it's growing, and then there are these IT clusters, and people build, people earn their careers, they found startups, they employ other people, and so on, which I think it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm coming here voluntarily during the war, which is a good indicator of how nice Kyiv is to spend time in when I could be in London. So lots of things I prefer about this place to London. Technology brings us on to ProZorro, but before I ask you about that, can I get you to tell us the story behind your beard?
Well, actually, when Maidan started, there was this weird belief that people were saying we are not going to leave the Maidan square and we are not going to shave until Yanukovych is out. And in the beginning, everyone thought that this was about maybe a couple weeks, but then it came into months, and I actually grew a beard because of this. And well, then my then girlfriend, now wife, liked this beard, so I kept it. And now I look like a hipster. And when I was in the government, people were told that I'm represent hipsters in the government, because every subculture needs to be represented.
And okay, I won't dig into that, but can you briefly explain who Yanukovych is and what Maidan is for people in the West who might not know?
Yanukovych was a really unpopular Ukrainian president who got into many corruption scandals and built himself a huge palace outside of Kyiv. It's even not a palace, as probably people imagine it, a building. No, it's a huge territory with dozens of buildings that has everything, including a restaurant in the form of a yacht, a personal boxing club, and so on and so on. And it has a personal zoo, a personal farm, because he didn't want to just drink your usual milk or eat your usual meat and so on. And eventually the protests arose after he refused to sign the EU association agreement and tried to shift the country towards Russia-dominated territories, the same as Belarus. And students' protests erupted, and he cracked down on them using the police and SWAT teams, and severely had many dozens of people severely bitten and detained, and at the later stages killed. There were massive protests involving millions of people, not only in Kyiv but all around the country, from Donetsk to Lviv. And eventually he was ousted, and there were new elections, and a new president and a new parliament came into power. So, for us, Maidan was something like Paris, revolutions, or like different protests in other capitals of the world, like against corruption, against crude government, against injustice, and this actually shows that Ukrainians are actually quite peaceful people, but we usually are not very happy with people not taking us seriously and basically subjugating to their will.
Well, in fact, these protests are a bit more extreme than ones you would have had in Paris, right? Because in Maidan, the students were shot on with rubber bullets initially, and then the police changed them for real bullets. So, I mean, people were properly murdered in the streets.
Well, yes, as I said, so I mean, it's the usual dictatorship, road when they try to crack down on protests, and when they think that they can just beat people into submission, and they think they can detain people, and I mean, there were also thousands of really surreal court punishments to people. The parliament introduced, really, strange totalitarian laws, like, for example, something like forbidding 3 cars driving in a row so that they don't assemble together, or making special punishments for people who wear snowboarding helmets on the streets, or something like this. And yes, eventually, and as it later became known, at the advice of Putin and many of his like generals, they employed more and more brutal techniques, eventually leading to a death of over 100 people, the so-called Heavenly 100, in the downtown of Kyiv.
Right, there's a great documentary about it called Winter on Fire for people in the West who want to learn about it. I watched it the first time I came to Ukraine. And when we were introduced by our mutual friend Ilya, who I interviewed last Monday, he described you as a post-Maidan reformer. I presume that means that there are lots of reforms you were able to do after Maidan that you wouldn't have been able to implement in Ukraine without that revolution happening.
Well, actually, Maidan led to a substantial shift in the government, as I said. So the old government and many older members of parliament were ousted, and during the new elections, like a lot of new people from the civil society, from media, from business joined the government, plus many people who never ever thought they ever going to become public servants. They thought that it was sort of like their job to come and change the country, and I was one of them. So my idea was pretty simple. I mean, I never ever was naive to think that the country has some kind of a new, honest, efficient, professional elite that is going to jump out of the bushes and do the job for us, and we're just going to wait and criticize it on Facebook. So you need to do your part. So I decided that I'm ready to sort of like take a sabbatical from my job for a year or a year and a half. I calculated it as, like a little bit longer than the average stay of the Ukrainian minister, which I calculated is around like 11 months. But eventually it was much more difficult to leave the government than to join the government. So I was constantly asked to stay and do something more, and we can't replace you, and so on. So as I actually told you, like only after 6 years in the government, I luckily finally got fired when there was like political change, and after the elections, the new government was formed, and all the previous heads were replaced as like a usual political cycle. So I was very lucky to get finally out, and my family was extremely happy for me to get back to private business and civil society work.
Obviously, you still have a good relationship with the government if they were asking you to work on the Damaged in Your Way project.
Well, yes, I mean, I still have some kind of hopefully good reputation with many people, and I still have many friends who are working in the government, and I was lucky to lead some teams that were recognized among really productive and one of the best in the country. So they resulted in many of these people growing up and becoming members of parliament, becoming members of the cabinet of ministers. I'm extremely happy for their careers, and obviously if they ask me for help or support, I'll do whatever I can for them.
Which, by the way, makes me want to go back to one thing briefly before we cover ProZorro, because it's stuck in my mind. You said that the government asked you guys to work on Damaged in Your Way on the second day of the invasion.
Yes.
It staggers me to think that anyone's thinking about anything other than pure survival on the second day of the invasion.
Well, I don't think that that's so surreal. So Ukraine, first of all, has a large tradition of civil society organizations being not just watchdogs that criticize the government, but as we call them, we're being sled dogs. We're helping and complementing the government where it lacks capacity, because still, the public service in Ukraine is not probably the strongest in the world, with average salaries still below market, and some often lacking professionalism, and sometimes still being considered corrupt. So, which basically means that the civil society, business associations, they can't afford just to criticize and like work harder, run better, and so on. So you expected to. I mean, if you want change, you have to be part of this change, and that was one of the things that we thought we could do. So I'm not really surprised about this happening, because academics and experts and different civil society organizations are helping the government try right now with many other things, like for example in working on sanctions against Russia and making lists of companies that still continue operating in Russia, or helping Russian government to circumvent sanctions. They're working on helping with bringing important military equipment to Ukraine. So Ukraine has a tradition of so-called volunteers who help the armies. This is also something that people in the West are probably not accustomed to. So they expect the government to do the job. We pay taxes and they buy guns for the guys who protect us in the military. But here we do understand that the government sometimes is not efficient. It can't do everything right. It sometimes is not aware of new technologies. There is a lot of bureaucracy involved and so on. So people just donate money to large funds which are organized enough, which employ very professional people in logistics and technology, who have close relations with the military generals, and then they bring some aid directly to the front line, which can be critically needed, like ranging from something relatively simple, such as helmets or personal body vests, to something like more sophisticated, but which can actually save the day, like some kind of a detail to repair the generator for the tank. I mean, the government theoretically might have it somewhere in the warehouse, but it's somewhere. And I mean, the tank needs to be going now. So, you donate, $1,000, you buy it, you bring it, you give it to the tank mechanic, and hopefully it can save lives. So it all comes together to a relatively unique structure, which I believe is one of the strengths of Ukraine and what differentiates us from many other, post-Soviet countries. There's a lot of these horizontal connections between people of different classes, professions, social strata, and a lot of trust that is built in such a way. I know people donating money to some volunteers they never ever met, who then donated it to drivers who bought something in the West and brought it to some place where they've never been, and without it being somehow stolen or damaged or anything. So that's, I think, a very important part of Ukraine's resilience. This is something that Russia and Putin personally definitely, they not even underestimate it, they just don't understand it.
Yeah, this was something that struck me the last time I was in Kyiv. It was when I was talking to people about their experience of the first few days of the war. It struck me that Ukraine had this very decentralized intelligence in the way it did things, whereas Russia, of course, was probably partially going ahead with the invasion because they had this centralized system with incredibly bad information, where Putin probably had inaccurate information about Ukraine through corrupt channels and so on. And so Ukraine was able to punch massively above its weight just because it was much more sophisticatedly organized. But can you tell us what ProZorro is and how it came about?
Well, I was lucky to be involved in some of the biggest reforms that happened after Maidan, and the one that is probably the most widely known is called ProZorro. So it's an e-procurement system that was a major part of the reform we did in procurement sector. So procurement is basically everything that the government and state companies, they buy using taxpayers' funds. It is massive in any country, and the UK included. And when I mentioned that Yanukovych was unfortunately notorious for his corruption and for building his mansions and siphoning billions of dollars. One of the sources of it was corrupt public procurement. When the government overpaid for stuff, when the government gave contracts to some cronies and so on. And the idea was that we can change it by making it, first of all, very transparent. Ukraine is probably the only country where anyone, like from outside the country, inside the country, can just look at any tender. All information is online. Absolutely all the documents are online. Nothing is in paper. You can take a look at all the historical bids of all the companies, both winners and losers in the tenders. And it's done not for the transparency for the sake of transparency, but to build trust, so that businesses know that nothing is hidden, nothing is in the dark. Another important part is the technological innovation. So ProZorro has it's like Ukrainian technology developed in-house using Ukrainian IT companies, and it has some structural innovations that make many types of corruption at least more difficult. Nothing is 100% bulletproof, especially in such complex systems, but it dramatically decreases, for example, the risk of leaking of bids. When you sealed bid, once you submit it, and then the corrupt government official just and leaks it to your competitor.
To be clear, that so it's if the government buys something as part of procurement, anyone can see who the government bought it from and how much they paid for it. Is that
well?
How it
First
works?
of all, they can see the tender documentation, what the government wants to buy. Everyone can apply, and you can challenge the tender if you think that the requirements are unfair. For example, they give some kind of privilege to one supplier because it says that not only you need to buy a computer, but it should be red, it should be in square form, and you should have such logo. Well, otherwise, it's a fair tender. So
that's anti-monopolistic,
yeah.
basically.
And
it's preventing.
it's not only anti-monopoly. It's just some kind of many safeguards against different types of collusions, different types of limiting competition, of just making it more difficult for people to participate. It might be there are many cases where it on paper might be fair, but for example, in many Western countries, and I'm sure your viewers are not aware of it. Sometimes bidders need to pay, and a lot, maybe £10,000 or more, just to take a look at the tender documentation.
Wow, okay.
Just to have a copy of it.
Right.
Because, it's in paper, someone needs to make the copies and send you to your office. You open it and, we can't apply because there is this requirement that we can't meet, and so on. And of course, if you make it easy to apply, if you make any SME, any small and medium business can just apply to any tender all over the country online without ever driving anywhere, without spending a lot on paperwork and bureaucracy, it obviously drives the prices lower. And if it increases competition, it also drives prices lower, and it also makes collusion more difficult. And if you're unhappy, there are mechanisms, if you ever bought anything on eBay and if you're unhappy with what is going on, you can challenge it. The tender is frozen, there is big flashing mark, it's frozen, and then it is going to be reviewed. Again, it's not, nothing is ideal, and there is still probably corruption in the system and still wrongdoings, as I sometimes tell, I can't change people over internet. I can't make a crude guy, an honest guy. Had I been able to do it, I would have founded a religion and not, and not an IT system. But
got the bid for it.
Yeah, but otherwise, it dramatically decreases problems in procurement by different international and independent assessments, for example, made by USAID or made by different independent IT companies. It decreased corruption in Ukraine twofold, and it allowed to save probably already over $10 billion for taxpayers. So it was pretty massive.
How much did it cost to set up?
Well, I think it cost less than $2 million to set up over a period of probably 2 years or something like this. So it's really cheap innovation.
Wait, as a percentage ROI on investment, I'm trying to do the sums in my head. That's something like that's a 500,000% return on investment? Is that?
Well, yeah. I mean, from this point of view, it's really, a great story. But you should take a look at it not only at the direct savings, but also at a lot of indirect benefits. Because when you squeeze corruption in procurement, you're also squeezing the flow of corrupt black money that can be used to buy judges, to pay to corrupt law enforcement, to lobby politicians, and it has a lot of other massive positive effects. And if you are giving contracts not to cronies or someone's friends, but to honest businesses or efficient businesses, you're also supporting the economy, because you're basically making fair access to government contracts. So I think the overall effects are massive. ProZorro has won literally dozens of international awards as one of the cool innovations in public sector. And yeah, I'm honored to work with a great team that actually set it all up.
Building ProZorro technologically is one thing, and obviously incredibly difficult. But then getting it implemented politically sounds immensely difficult as well. Like, how did you persuade people to adopt this system when there must have been huge vested interests who were, it was in their interest to stop you implementing it?
Well, I think that any project, it involves obviously not only designing it, but also agreeing it with major stakeholders, and also devising some kind of plan how you're going to implement it in stages. I don't think that any reform can be implemented otherwise. So in this case, we obviously started with an MVP, so a minimum viable product, something that can be tested to try to prove that it works and to get more public support, both from Ukrainian civil society, from businesses, from people who saw that it actually works, that it decreases corruption, from international experts, and so on. And then we just waited, and were very persuasive and very patient. Actually, I tried to put in on vote the law on the new law on public procurement on vote in the parliament for several months, and we were lucky in the last day, or the last working day of 2015. It was Christmas. Well, like Christmas in Western tradition is not so widely celebrated in Ukraine, so it was a working day, the 25th of December, and many members of parliament were already happy. It was also the voting day for the budget, and they were happy, to have it done. That they finally had some kind of a solution, and to go home on vacation, and so on. And my minister and a couple of other friends, they came to the prime minister and said that, look, like maybe we can do something, an extra piece of good things. And he said, okay, but are you sure you have the votes for it? I said, definitely, 100% we have the votes. Of course, I was not sure, but I mean, you need to try. And actually, we were lucky, and it was a very turbulent voting. It was put for vote many times, and actually, the parliament voted yay. I think it was something like maybe 2 a.m. in the morning already. And actually, I stayed there all night, and then I texted all my colleagues and subordinates, and friends, that yeah, we did it. I even have a famous picture, well, famous for me, of course. I mean, and my mom, of course. Yeah, where I'm actually dancing in the cabinets, cabinet space, where in the parliament Ukrainian cabinet of ministers sits, and where you're allowed to go, and I'm dancing there after the voting. I mean, it still obviously was not, all the job done, because you had to pass a lot of bylaws, you had to do hundreds of trainings all over the country, you had to have hundreds of so-called business breakfasts with businesses, to show them what's going on. Obviously, you were going through trials and errors, where, you always had these cycles of finding out what works and what needs to be, redone, and so on. But eventually, ProZorro became the standard. And even now, there are still probably many people with vested interests and crooks who are unhappy about it, but it's already, the new standard.
Are there any other countries that have anything like this? Because you certainly don't have this in the UK, right? Like, I don't think I could find out how much the government paid for something and I wouldn't be able to access the tender.
Well, elements of public procurement, electronic public procurement are working in many countries. Ukraine still is, till this day, probably one of the leaders here. I'm not sure we are still number one, but at least somewhere in top three. But generally speaking, it's usually the developing countries that have the most robust and interesting and technologically innovative procurement systems because they need it. Because in richer countries, people are less maybe interested in what is going on, and maybe you have a more, again, efficient law enforcement and judicial system where they can probably punish the crooks better, and you definitely have much better pay for public officials, which supposedly means they're more professional and probably less corrupt. But you still need to remember that in the UK, the average open tender takes about 10 to 11 months, while in Ukraine it on average takes 48 days.
Okay, last question. Do you think, because of this and other things, there is a possibility that Ukraine would overtake more developed nations just because it's going to leapfrog ahead of them because it's adopting better technologies for development?
I would put it another way. I mean, I would definitely be happy, and in the area of public ProZorro, I know that this is, of public procurement, I know that this is already happening, that we can pass from a country that receives aid to a country that is able to help other countries. And I think that's what a normal cycle of development should be. I can only reiterate that we're extremely grateful to taxpayers in many other countries that support Ukraine and continue to put trust in the country. And eventually we should grow not only to the country that is sustainable and doesn't require any external support, but a country who is able to support others in this regard. And if we build something cool in e-procurement, then we'll be very happy to donate this open source software to other countries. We did something also very cool in electronic services, and Ukrainian app DIA is already well known in many countries. They recently had a DIA, yeah, they recently had a big summit in Washington showcasing it to different other politicians and stakeholders all over the world. So I think that's actually cool, you know, when you can basically give back and maybe like give back part of this moral support that was given to you.
We'll just briefly finish here because we started in the playground that was hit by one missile. My Airbnb where I was staying was just there. And when I heard that there were missiles in Kyiv 5 days after I left, the last time I visited, I recognized this tree-lined avenue and then realized that one of them must have landed very close to my Airbnb, and in fact it landed just there. Is that right?
Yeah, actually you see a patch of fresh asphalt. So that was a small crater where the missile hit. You can probably still see, you know, some of the damages on the walls and the damaged cupola of the building, and all these windows and the facade was broken and only partially repaired. It was during the rush hour, so you know the intersection was filled with cars, and I think close to a dozen people died, and many more were wounded. And so it actually shows again how fragile it is. So I mean, you can stand here, and the weather is good, and you can have your coffee, and Wi-Fi is working, and then just boom, and because of some, you know, craziness from Putin, you are dead. And you are killed for nothing, just for the fact that you are being Ukrainian. So, and that is a thing that many people again need to understand. This is not the war about signing some kind of paper. This is the war of extermination. So Putin just basically wants to exterminate Ukrainians. He wants to remake all Ukrainians into Russians. And I hope that this is also a story of Ukrainian resilience, because it actually shows that despite, you know, all his efforts and spending billions upon billions on rockets and tanks and guns and killing hundreds of thousands of his own conscripted soldiers, eventually, you know, life prevails, and, you know, the road is being rebuilt, and the windows are slowly being replaced, and people walk the street, and, you know, normal life continues, and the invasion is eventually going to be repelled.
And your shirt is in fact a symbol of Ukrainian resistance. Because when you arrived, I thought it was a traditional Ukrainian shirt, but then I saw it has a piece of modern technology on the bottom. Where is your shirt from?
Well, actually, the company I buy my suits from, it's a Ukrainian company, it's called Intpashiv. But actually, before the war, they took, they had clients in London as well. So they started making this traditional Ukrainian embroidery, but in green and using more military motifs, with tanks and soldiers and planes and so on. And it became quite popular. So actually, Zelensky wore a similar shirt to a couple of meetings, and I think it's also a nice touch because it's a blend of old and new. So this is old, very traditional embroidery, the same as the German, these shorts or
Lederhosen.
Yeah, or some kind of,
This is better than lederhosen.
Yeah, or some kind of Scottish kilts and so on. So this is what Ukrainian men traditionally wear, and every region had their own, type of this embroidery. And you can actually, distinguish people in the old paintings, from where they came by looking at this embroidery. But it's also a sign of how the country adapts. But it's also a sign that was, done by bespoke tailor using, the best technologies available in the field. And this is something that is competitive in the world, that is exported to, to the UK and to the other countries. So I do hope this is also a symbol of new and modern country.
Yeah, buy Ukrainian fashion. Cut. If you like this video, like and share so that other people can discover it, and subscribe and turn on notifications so that you can see new releases when they come out. And if you'd like to pay for my travel into a war zone, support Operation Tiggy on Patreon. I'm also hiring a local team, so this creates employment in a country that's had its economy badly hit by the war.